Next stop, 7th floor, Chapter 7, American Revolution Review Video. Ding! All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our Chapter 7 American Revolution review video. I'm going to kind of take us through the study guide here as we kind of recap some of the finer points of our glorious American Revolution. Question number 1 opens just asking you what were some of the weaknesses and some of the strengths of the Continental or the American Army at the start of the American Revolution. I ask you to list a couple, 2 or 3 for each. Weaknesses. Weaknesses were aplenty for the American Army. For one, they were untrained, right? They were undisciplined. They were farmers. They were merchants. They were shopkeepers. They were not trained military soldiers. They had no formal training. A second weakness is that they were ill-equipped, right? They were very poorly equipped. They didn't have proper uniforms for a large portion of the war. They didn't always have proper ammunition. They didn't have enough ammunition. They didn't have gunpowder. They didn't have supplies. They didn't have food. Remember, at times they didn't even have shoes on their feet that they could use, right? The American Army was very poorly equipped. They were small in number. The size of the Continental Army, remember we read the size of the American Army was much smaller than the British Army. And so smaller in size, smaller in skill, and smaller in resources. However, they did have a couple of kind of key advantages or a couple of key strengths that really helped them out. One of that was their military leadership. We've talked a lot about George Washington, and he is one of many great American military commanders. And another one of the strengths for the American Army, of course, was their heart, their passion. They simply wanted it more. They were fighting for something. Remember when we played Capture the Flag in class, the blue team, they were fighting for something. If they won, they received a prize. The red team, the British team, they weren't fighting for anything. They received no prize for winning. So that American team, they were fighting. Their lives depend on it. If they lose, they will be tried for treason. The war is literally being fought in their backyards. They cared. They were fighting for freedom, for independence, for the Declaration of Independence. They had passion on their side. So passion and leadership, we're going to see how that was able to overcome their weaknesses. Second question talks about the strengths and weaknesses then, of course, of the British Army. The strengths for the British Army, well, quite simply put, straight away, they were better trained. They were professional soldiers. They did this for a living. Secondly, they were better equipped. They had the money to fund their army. They had nice uniforms. They had proper weapons. They had proper supplies. They had food to eat. They had shoes on their feet. So the British Army was just better supplied, better trained, and then also they were larger. They were massive. Remember, Great Britain at the time, most powerful nation in the world, and so their army is also rather large, very substantial. So they've got this strong, well-fed, well-trained army raining down on the American colonies. However, the British Army, we know they did have a couple of weaknesses. One of those weaknesses was their leadership. Although they were trained well and they were strong as an army on the whole, their leadership was very poor. And another one of their weaknesses, they had no heart. They weren't fighting for anything. They were thousands of miles from home, fighting a war that maybe they did or didn't necessarily believe in. But even if they won the war, what did they win? What did these soldiers win? Nothing really. They'd get paid, they'd go home, and that was that. So by the end, they started to lose sight in their cause. They started to lose faith, lose belief in their cause, and their will to kill gradually diminished. Our third question that you're asked asks you, the War for Independence inspired hope in many African Americans. Why? Well, simply put, the Declaration of Independence. We believe that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. African American slaves, they looked around and said, I think that might include us too. Let's fight this war for independence, and maybe we will become free. Fourth question, after the American Revolution, we know that slavery did not end in the, throughout all of the colonies or throughout all of the United States. And a large number of African Americans were still enslaved. However, many colonies began to take steps to end slavery, particularly in New England. They took these steps to end slavery, to abolish slavery, and end it forever. So it did have some positive impact for African Americans. Fifth question on there. What weakness of the Continental Army led to a number of their defeats? They had the passion. The American Army had the passion. They had the leadership. But their lack of experience was what really led to a number of defeats early on in the war. They simply didn't know how to fight. And this lack of experience really hurt them early on in the war. Number 6, asking you who wrote The Crisis. Well, T-Pain, Thomas Paine, of course, wrote The Crisis. You remember in class we compared that to Herb Brooks and the Miracle Speech. We watched the Miracle Speech and talked about how that inspired the Americans to fight the Soviets. Well, when George Washington, acting as Herb Brooks, reads The Crisis to the American Army before the battles at Trenton and at Princeton, Washington reads The Crisis to his men. These are the times that try men's souls. He inspires them. He amps them up and leads them on this successful attack on Christmas, the day after Christmas, and kind of rallies the troops early on in 1776 and 1777 when it's looking like that revolution is just going to die, when it's just going to fizzle out. So number 7 then, after 1776, Washington revises his military strategy. And remember, a strategy is an overall plan to do something like winning a war. So Washington, after 76, he revises his strategy and he adopts a more defensive strategy. That's right, he goes, wait a second, I don't have to get a lot of big victories. I don't have to conquer the British. I simply have to survive. I simply have to avoid a crushing defeat. Our 8th question, we talked about 2 effects. American victory at Saratoga. Right, Saratoga, right up here in upstate New York. We're going to talk a moment. The British strategy, remember, early on in the war is to capture New England. If we talk about the colonies as a snake, right, just like the join or die poster, and the head on that join or die poster, of course, represents New England. And so if we talk about New England as the head of the revolutionary snake, Britain's job was to simply cut off the head of that snake. You cut off the head of the snake, you kill the snake. It might wriggle around for a little bit, but it will die. And so they thought if we can cut off where the revolution began, the heart of the revolution, if we can cut off the head of it, the revolution will wriggle up and die. Great strategy, perfectly sound strategy, except for when your strategy doesn't work. And in this case, at the Battle of Saratoga, the British strategy did not work. Burgoyne is defeated by Gates, and the Americans are victorious, preventing the British from taking control of the Hudson River and cutting off the head of the revolution. Following this, there are some people in Europe, the French, they're going, the pesky British, they lost at Saratoga, maybe we should help the Americans, no? Oui, oui. Right, following the Battle of Saratoga, the French, oui, oui, and the Spanish, si, si. The French, the Spanish, they decide, I think now we can become official, formal allies of the Americans. And they join the fight, especially the French. They join the fight on behalf of the Americans. No longer are they just being these cheerleaders and giving them support and money and supplies. They're actually going to send troops and get actively involved. Huge deal. That also talks about number 9, what is an ally? Well, that's just a friend, another country that helps you in a war. And then who was our biggest ally during the war? France. Number 10. As the war progressed, as it goes on and on and on and on, many people in Britain began to oppose the war. And a large part of that, money. It's expensive. Fighting a war way overseas, now there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles in between here, thousands of miles in here that are separating these 2 nations that are at war, Europe, England, and the Americas. And it's expensive to fight this war. It's a long war. It costs a lot of money, and it costs a lot of lives. So this cost of money and lives, people back home in Great Britain are going, yo, King, Parliament, I think maybe it's time we end this deal. And so people in Britain by the end of the war, they were no longer supporting the war. The support was dropping. You see that frequently in our American history when the United States has been involved in long conflicts. We've seen it today in 2010 where we're involved in conflict war in Afghanistan and Iraq. And as these wars, these conflicts continue to drag on, they cost more money, they cost more lives, and public opinion of the war begins to drop and say, hey, maybe this isn't the fight worth fighting anymore. So we see a lot of similarities between the American Revolution and war today. Trenton and Princeton, number 11. Why were these victories important to the American Army? Well, simply, it proved that the British could be beaten. They hadn't had any real clear, decisive victories over the British until Trenton and Princeton. And following these 2 victories, the Americans were like, all right, the British can be beaten. We can beat them. Number 12, when General Burgoyne, a British general, took American forces at Albany, New York, took on the forces at Albany, New York, right here, he had a very clear disadvantage. What was that disadvantage? He didn't know the land, right? And this was a huge disadvantage for the British Army in general, especially in the South. they didn't know the land. They didn't know the lay of the land. And so it's like playing hide and go seek. It's like when you invite some buddies over, your cousins over, and like, hey, let's play hide and go seek tag. You know all the good hide and go seek places, and they know none of them. Of course you win. Similar to the American Revolution. The Americans, they were born and raised on this soil. For generations, they lived here. These British soldiers, they had never been here before, some of them. They had never been down in the South before, some of them. They didn't know the land. They didn't know how to react to it. So a huge disadvantage, not knowing the land. Number 13, as the tide of the war turns, right? As the tide of the war turns, we see that a lot of fighting pushes further to the south. Well, that makes sense for the British. Their strategy was not effective in the north. They head south. There are more loyalists in the south. However, guerrilla fighting, hit and run fighting. We're talking about number 13 now. And we don't mean guerrilla like, smash British. No, we don't mean that type of guerrilla, but we mean those hit and run, you know, kind of like, ha, gotcha, kind of that hit and run, attack and retreat type of technique, right? If I'm going to go take on a world heavyweight champion boxer, if I'm going to go fight Brock Lesnar, I'm not going to stand toe-to-toe with him because the fight will last for about as long as it takes for his fist to meet my face, and it will be over. So I'll use hit and run tactics. The Americans in the South, we talked about, you know, the swamp fox and these guerrilla fighters. They would attack and then they would retreat back into the swamps and the trees. Very effective fighting style in the South, and the British hated it. They're like, well, I say, that's not very gentlemanly of you, right? So the British, I'm sorry about that accent, that was rubbish. But the British did not like this fighting style, and it wore them down. They got sick and tired of being attacked and their enemies running away. They thought, come out and face us. We want to fight you. And the Americans were like, if we face you straight up, you will cream us, so we're going to attack and run, attack and run, attack and run. And it wears them down. It wears them down a lot. And we know that, of course, eventually it caused them to let their guard down at Yorktown. And so if you were to describe the overall flow of the war to the beginning, moving on to number 14 now, at the beginning the Americans were outmatched, they were outgunned, they were getting beat, but as the war progressed, they changed their strategy. They didn't stick to their initial plan. They changed their strategy, they changed their plan of attack, and they improved. And they got better, and they continued to fight, and they continued to wear down the British. And so changing that strategy over time, they get better, they improve, and they're eventually able to defeat the British, of course, you know, Yorktown being the last major battle. Number 15, we've talked about how hugely important the American Revolution was. Not obviously just for our nation, but worldwide. It had a worldwide impact. One event that we looked at a little bit was the French Revolution. Remember, we watched that Bad Romance cover. La, la, liberté, égalité, fraternité. Yeah, Lady Gaga, look out, I'm coming for you, right? But the French Revolution, inspired by the American Revolution. In the 1800s, there are a bunch of British colonies still down here in South America. They're going to look to the American Revolution and be like, wait a second. We shouldn't be governed by the British either. So it kind of sets off a series of revolutions around the world based on watching the American Revolution, right? So we kind of led the way, and we're kind of the model for this. Even our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence kind of served as a model for all these other countries. Number 16, in addition to independence, what was something else, all right, the Americans got after the war? Treaty of Paris, 1783, signed, of course, you know, in Paris in 1783. That says, yes, we recognize America as a free and independent nation, but we're also going to give them all of this land here east of the Mississippi River. So although Britain had defeated France during the French and Indian War and took this land, now the Americans had defeated the British, and 20 years later, they get kicked out of North America. We're going to see later there are still some Brits roaming around about in Canada, and that's going to cause some issues. But for the most part, the Americans got all the land east of the Mississippi River. And then number 17, just the Battle of Yorktown. Again, remember that, wrapping it up, that the guerrilla-style fighting in the South eventually caused Cornwallis to retreat out onto this little peninsula here in Yorktown. Whoops, big mistake by Cornwallis, right? Because the French Navy comes in here and surrounds them on the seaside, and then the French troops come down from here, American troops come in here as well, basically surround Cornwallis, the British on all sides, wore them down over a period of about 2 weeks until Cornwallis and his army of 8,000 men had to surrender, and this signaled the beginning of the end. From there, it wasn't going to be much longer until the war officially ended. You know, the peace treaty wasn't signed until 1783, but that pretty much signals it. All right, so there it is. There is our American Revolution study guide in about 10 to 15 minutes or so. I hope that that helps to make sense. I hope you're ready to rock this test that you're going to take. I know you're going to do fantastic. It's been great studying with you. Keep it real. Deuces.